I'm a student at the University of Maine, Orono. I'm studying English, and this play seemed very interesting because of its rather grim thematic topic, but also but also the way in which it explores how people respond to such things. All right, so Ford begins his play in the cell of Friar Bonaventura, a monk, tutor, and confessor for Giovanni, a model student. Giovanni confesses to lusting after his sister, Annabella, and begins an affair with her in the next scene. Despite her eventual marriage, Annabella continues her affair with Giovanni, but is convinced of her errors by Bonaventura and renounces Giovanni in a letter. The play ends with Giovanni killing Annabella before being killed himself. In Ford's play, pleasure and faith serve as conflicting character motivations for Giovanni, Annabella, and Friar Bonaventura. For Giovanni, pleasure takes precedence over faith, and for what it's worth, I've used pleasure and desire interchangeably. Actually, I think pleasure captures the character motivations better than the word desire, so I changed that. It's really about pleasure and faith in this play. For Giovanni, pleasure takes precedence over faith to the point of replacing it altogether. This hedonistic attitude is shown in his opportunism, in which he co-opts his scholastic education to justify the seduction of his sister, twisting the humanist emphasis on rhetoric as a tool to enhance content by replacing content with rhetoric. For Bonaventura, faith takes precedence over pleasure, visibly so in his life of monasticism, and he denounces Giovanni's rationalization of incest as blasphemous. Critical to the play's tragic conclusion, Giovanni has discarded faith by the opening scene and openly scoffs Friar Bonaventura's threats of eternal punishment. Annabella, the sister, differs from Giovanni in justifying her actions because she lacks his knowledge of scholastic teachings or humanist thought with which to rationalize incest. In her case, Annabella simply ignores faith, instead of disproving it to herself as Giovanni does. Because Annabella retains faith and lacks knowledge of scholastic teachings or humanist thought with which to rationalize incest, Bonaventura's threats of eternal punishment for incest are convincing to her. All three characters show the conflict of pleasure and faith in deciding the morality of incest, and their conflicting conclusions illuminate the role of these two character traits as central to Ford's play. First, Giovanni. Giovanni, a pupil of Bonaventura's, lusts after his sister Annabella and uses his training in logic to argue that, far from forbidding incest, the church should promote it. Though invoking the teachings of the church on marriage, Giovanni's indifference to their intent is obvious. For instance, his most elaborate defense of incest uses a scholastic concept of the connection between appearance and virtue, beginning by reminding the friar that it is a principle which you have taught, that the frame and composition of the mind doth follow the frame and composition of the body. Giovanni pleads that, where the body's furniture is beauty, the mind's must needs be virtue. My sister's beauty, being rarely fair, is rarely virtuous. Based on a dubious principle, but one that Bonaventura himself agrees with, it is difficult to contradict the train of thought which Giovanni uses to reach his conclusion. Here, Giovanni's sophistry perverts the Renaissance variation of medieval scholasticism, or Renaissance humanism, which placed special emphasis on the form in which an idea is expressed. One study of Renaissance thought by Alistair McGrath in 2004 draws on an earlier study by Paul Christler in 1979 in characterizing humanism as the pursuit of eloquence through a cultural and educational program based upon written and spoken eloquence. Vitally, McGrath references earlier studies as agreeing with his conclusion, that Renaissance humanism places emphasis on rhetoric as the discipline that brings out what is distinctive and fundamental to humanity, allowing a more cultured and hence more humane people to be distinguished from their uncultured neighbors. By embodying excellent content in excellent rhetoric, the Renaissance humanists sought to communicate at the most effective level possible. Ideally, this meant that the rhetoric equaled the content in quality, but McGrath asserts that sometimes this resulted in a de-emphasis of the ideas themselves, especially in the case of early Christian theologians such as Augustine of Hippo or John Chrysostom, who were sometimes seen simply as individuals who excelled in the excellence of their speech and writing. By sometimes creating distance between, or even divorcing, the authors of classical philosophy from their works, Renaissance humanists ran the risk of emphasizing rhetoric over content in their discourse. At such times, they give a prototype for Giovanni, whose strength is the mastery of rhetoric, whereby he nullifies the substance of his arguments through convincing use of language. Giovanni swiftly makes beauty equivalent to virtue, before pointing out that, as Annabella is beautiful, she must likewise be virtuous. The form of rhetoric is better than the idea, but this argument, like most of what Giovanni says, is significant only as a show of capable rhetoric. Giovanni's indifference to Bonaventura's teaching reveals his knowledge of logic and religion as a means to justify his desire for pleasure. Because Giovanni has this knowledge of both logic and religion, he can overcome any objection society at the time could offer to prevent him from committing incest. This ability, in Giovanni's own view at least, exempts him from societal or religious rules of behavior. For instance, Giovanni responds to Friar Bonaventura's urging for repentance by saying that, "I'll swear my fate's my God." More tellingly, Giovanni rants about how, "'Tis not my lust, but 'tis my fate that leads me on. Keep fear and low, faint-hearted shame with slaves." Giovanni's rationalization of class implies that he is above shame, which is a sign of inferiority. Later, in response to Bonaventura's denunciations, Giovanni quips that your age o'errules you. Nor are age and class the only signs of inferiority to Giovanni, who condemns academic asceticism as well, saying, "Let the poring bookman dream of other worlds. My world and all of happiness is here." Having subordinated all his actions to pleasure, Giovanni has also lost any faith in religion, though this is clear even in the first scene, when he responds to Bonaventura's worries about incestuous lust in unconcerned sacrilegious reference to his sister's beauty as that beauty which the gods would make a god of. Later, in confessing to his affair with Annabella, Giovanni responds to Bonaventura's denouncement by saying that, "Had you youth like mine, you'd make her love your heaven and her divine." These comparisons always place Annabella in the place of any Christian concept of God. While continuing to speak with Bonaventura, Giovanni inevitably rejects what the friar considers essential, as seen when the friar opens the play by saying that better 'tis to bless the sun than to reason why it shines. Yet he, God, thou talkest of, is above the sun. Giovanni's answers, starting with his basic premise, "Must I not do what all men else may, love?" and ending with a final denunciation of conventions against incest. "Shall a customary form from man to man of brother and sister be a bar?" ignores Bonaventura's initial statement that incest is a violation of God's existence. Giovanni dismisses divine authority, admitting as much in the following scene, saying, "I have even wearied heaven with prayers. What wit or art could counsel I have practiced, but alas, I find all these but dreams and old men's tales." Notably, this admission is preceded with another allusion to Annabella's godlike status, saying, "Oh, that it were not in religion's sin to make out of love a god and worship it." Giovanni's religion is no more than unbridled hedonism, summarized in his own attitude that "my world and all of happiness is here, and I'd not change it for the best to come. A life of pleasure is Elysium. Giovanni hints at this abandonment of his Christianity throughout the play in his baiting of Bonaventura, taunting the friar by saying that hell you oft have prompted is naught else but slavish and fond superstitious fear, and I could prove it too. Likewise, when Bonaventura shows Annabella's letter of repentance to Giovanni, his reaction is a sacrilege, saying that you make some petty devil factor twixt my love and your religion-masked sorceries. Giovanni's hedonism places himself as its god, not Annabella, despite his earlier intentions of worshipping her as a goddess. It is my world that rules Giovanni, not Annabella's. Annabella is subordinate to Giovanni's hedonism, along with his own vestiges of academic training and faith. Thus, when Annabella repents of her affair with Giovanni and hints that she will reveal it to the world, he does not hesitate in killing the one he initially referred to as a goddess. At all times, Giovanni's use of logic and religion is opportunistic, knowingly applying his education as a means to satisfy his pleasure, and discarding faith as a useless appendage of ignorance and senility. Now for Friar Bonaventura. Bonaventura, though an academic by training, has retired to a monastery by the first scene, and regards Giovanni's justifications with horror. In response to Giovanni's defense of incest, Bonaventura does not construct logical counterpoints, but instead invokes the teachings of the Church, saying that heaven admits no wits that presumed how to prove there was no God, with foolish grounds of art. This line is followed by his comparison of those who give thanks for the sun to those who question why it shines, and Bonaventura's already shown indifference to systematic critique. The friar essentially holds that, if there is faith, pleasure must be subordinate to it, regardless of arguments to the contrary. If God exists, he is above the sun, and to be given full authority in determining the actions of one's life. For a retired academic, Bonaventura's attitude towards Christianity is surprisingly anti-intellectual. Bonaventura hesitates in trying to convince Giovanni by logic that incest is wrong, rather arguing that no logic or reason can subvert the teaching of God, and by extension, the Church. Instead of directly answering Giovanni's arguments, Bonaventura calls him to repentance. Repentance, for thou hast moved a majesty above with thy unranged blasphemy. Clearly, Bonaventura views Giovanni's faith in God, being a divine authority, as the best grounds for convincing him of the wrongness of incest. Because Giovanni disagrees with this presupposition, Bonaventura is never able to convince him that what he wants is wrong. Indeed, Bonaventura seems to recognize that Giovanni has abandoned faith entirely when he groans that the fruit of all my hopes are lost in thee, as thou art in thyself. Bonaventura's summary of Giovanni being lost in thyself is curiously apt, since the play ends with Giovanni's destruction as a consequence of his lust. The only occasion when Bonaventura attempts to systematically argue against Giovanni is when the antihero uses the scholastic concept of an appearance-mind connection to justify the virtuousness of Annabella's love for himself. The friar responds by saying, "O ignorance and knowledge, long ago, if we were sure there were no deity, no heaven or hell, then to be led alone by nature's light might instant some defense, but 'tis not so. Thou wilt find that nature is in heaven's position blind." Here Bonaventura admits, interestingly enough, that he does not disagree with Giovanni's logic, but rather his presuppositions. Because Bonaventura believes there is a God, he assumes that this deity has precedence over the natural inclinations of life. Unsurprisingly, Giovanni does not respect Bonaventura's statement, and there is no result from the friar's modest attempt at systematic logic. Arguably, there is no reason to think Bonaventura could convince Giovanni by arguing with logical counterpoints, since Giovanni does not view faith as something to submit to, but rather as an obstacle to overcome. However, Bonaventura's ignoring of Giovanni's logical objections make it easier for Giovanni to dismiss the Church's teachings as fodders for slaves and servants. Still, given the ease with which he lies to Annabella about the church's condoning incest, even logical counterpoints are unlikely to convince Giovanni of his actions being wrong. Annabella is interesting because of her metamorphosis as a character. Unlike Giovanni, who simply grows increasingly hedonistic, or the friar, who simply remains self-denying, Annabella changes her attitude towards pleasure over the course of the play. Initially, she consents quite willingly to Giovanni's actions, even admitting that she longed for the same pleasures in her past. In her expository dialogue with Giovanni, Annabella says that what thou hast urged my captive heart had long resolved. Yet when confronted by Bonaventura's denunciations during confession, Annabella is utterly ashamed, begging, "Is there no way left to redeem my miseries?" To which the friar responds, "There is, despair not, heaven is merciful, and offers grace even now." Nor is this insincere, for, at a later point, she soliloquizes over her past, eventually writing a letter of repentance in her own blood, renouncing Giovanni, which is given to the friar to deliver. Annabella does not at once hate Giovanni, nor even cease desiring and adoring him, as it is evident in the fight between her and her new husband, Sorenzo. Evidently, Annabella's change of heart comes not from a lack of desire of pleasure, but from a conviction that she has done wrong, in turn stemming from her faith in a divine authority, as represented by the church's authority. Thus, when Bonaventura describes a place in a black and hollow vault where day is never seen, and goes on to explain how in this place dwell many thousand sundry sorts of never-dying deaths, Annabella is moved by his description of eternal punishment and repents. Though Annabella unknowingly dooms herself to death by Giovanni's dagger, it seems unlikely that Annabella would act differently even if she knew. While neither she nor the friar foresee death, both assume severe hardship. As the closing remark to Annabella's confession, Bonaventura says, "Remember what must come. Are you content?" To which she replies, "I am." Here, Bonaventura is successful in convincing the wrongs of incest, but Annabella is more likely to be convinced, since she shares his view that faith in a divine authority takes precedence over pleasure. Moreover, she never expresses the same level of doubt in Christian teachings and practice that her brother Giovanni does. Indeed, Annabella's acquiescence is conditioned on a false understanding that the church approved of such a relationship. That said, Giovanni is the only source of this unique interpretation of church teaching, and his glib, "I have asked counsel of the Holy Church. I have asked counsel of the Holy Church, who tells me I may love you," seems very insubstantial. Certainly, Annabella does not press her brother's passing reference to priestly approval, and it is unusual that, assuming she believes this statement, Annabella does not press Giovanni about a formal wedding. If the church does, in fact, condone their relationship, why begin it in secrecy? The only obstacle would be Annabella's father's consent, and even this might be possible if the church approved the marriage, since Annabella's father, Florio, makes no secret of his disdain for her current suitors. At any rate, Annabella's willingness to make their vows in secret, despite the apparent easiness of receiving clerical blessings, seems to imply a state of denial on her part. According to Roman Catholic doctrine, Annabella is vincibly ignorant. This means she chose not to ask questions that she was both capable of and obliged to ask, making her responsible for the consequences of her actions, namely divine judgment. Importantly, she never claims to have been deceived by her brother, despite at least 2 interactions with Bonaventura, as well as a soliloquy of regret. This silence over Giovanni's lie seems to reinforce the suspicion one has that Annabella chose to take him at his word against her own suspicion of the truth. While inconsistent, Annabella's approach means that faith is not so much eviscerated as put in shadow. This leaves a belief, albeit hesitant, in a divine authority that likely condemns her actions, giving Bonaventura's brimstone and fire speech a quality of relevance for Annabella that is absent for Giovanni. Believing in divine judgment, Annabella willingly repents of her actions and is martyred. Though as rational as any of the characters in Ford's play, Annabella does not share her brother's hubris in regarding logic as a means to justify all pleasure, never trying to use religious or logical teachings for her own means. Instead, she avoids contemplation of the rightness of her actions until her confession with the friar, then critiques those actions in one of the closing scenes. Fittingly, her criticism of the false joys answers Giovanni's earlier argument that the frame and composition of the mind doth follow the frame and composition of the body, and therefore, where the body's furniture is beauty, the mind's must needs be virtue. In her soliloquy, Annabella responds to this presumption of an outward beauty that signifies inward virtue, with a line, "No, I confess, beauty that clothes the outside of the face is cursed, if it be not clothed with grace." This straightforward statement displays the flaw in Giovanni's argument, namely, that outward beauty does not predict inward virtue, and that in Christian thought is worse than useless without inward virtue. That Annabella makes the play's only logical argument against incest is fitting, since she is the only character who expresses desire for the same pleasures as Giovanni. Indeed, she is one beauty to a double soul, as her brother describes the two of them, and no one is better suited to contradicting Giovanni from his own perspective than she is. All his reactions and feelings are Annabella's as well, so that her denunciation of their affair is both ironic and moving. Annabella serves almost as an interpreter for Giovanni in this soliloquy, summing up his tortured hedonism by saying that they who sleep in lethargies of lust hug their confusion, making heaven unjust. Again, her words have little to do with anything Giovanni told her, or even anything she said herself. Instead, they counter Giovanni's frequent curses of a divine authority that could condemn his actions as petty double factors and religion-masked sorceries. Annabella is the antithesis of her brother in that she is faced with the same moral conflict, yet resolves it by cutting off from her lust rather than embracing it. In the course of the play, Giovanni, Annabella, and Friar Bonaventura each demonstrate their views on the predominance of faith over pleasure, or vice versa. Ultimately, the subordination of faith and reason to pleasure for Giovanni means the placing of self in priority over the other. For Annabella, the subordination of pleasure and reason to faith means the sacrifice of self to the other. As for Bonaventura, he leaves the scene of action once the bloodshed begins. While the moral focus of their struggles, incest, is anything but mundane, their ethical dilemmas are very much so. Ford's genius is that he places ordinary behaviors in an extraordinary situation, possibly unsettling us as his audience or his reader, who see Giovanni's, Bonaventura's, and Annabella's in their everyday life. Maybe we see them in ourselves as well.